Hey guys, welcome back. If you're new here, welcome. Dim the lights. Put your phone face down on the nightstand. Pull whatever blanket you have a little closer, because tonight we are going somewhere cold, somewhere windy, somewhere that smells faintly of salted fish and wet wool. Tonight we're talking about Viking women. Now before you imagine horned helmets and battle axes, just let that image go. The horned helmet thing is a myth, by the way. 19th century Romanticism. The Vikings would have found that idea deeply impractical. You can't wear a horned helmet under a hood in a North Atlantic storm. Nobody is doing that. Nobody's sane, anyway. So let go of all of that. Breathe out. Get comfortable. What we're actually going to do tonight is spend a very long time, a really genuinely long time, drifting through the lives of women in the Viking Age. Who they were, what they did, what they owned, who they married, who they divorced, how they ran farms and households, and sometimes entire regions while their husbands were off doing whatever it is men with longboats convinced themselves was urgent. We'll talk about the sagas, the laws, the graves, the runes, the mythological figures who shaped how Viking women saw themselves. We'll meet real women, named women, women who left actual marks on history, not just footnotes. And we'll wander through the social world they lived in, which was weird and complicated, and, in a few specific ways, surprisingly conservative for the 9th century. I said surprisingly. I didn't say uniformly. There will be nuance. There is always nuance. That's what makes history interesting instead of a bumper sticker. But first, just settle in. The Viking Age, for context, runs roughly from the late 8th century, around 793, which is when the raid on Lindisfarne happened, the one that made all the monks write anxious letters, to about 1066, which is when the Normans invaded England, and everyone sort of agrees the medieval period shifted gears. That's about 270 years, not a blip. A substantial stretch of time during which Scandinavian people, Norwegians, Danes, Swedes, and people from what is now Iceland and Greenland, were doing an enormous amount of sailing, trading, raiding, settling, farming, fighting, and dying. And throughout all of that, women were present, obviously, because that is how populations work. The difference is that Viking society, for a variety of reasons we're going to spend a very long time exploring, gave women a more defined, and in some cases more legally protected role than many of their European contemporaries. Not equality, not feminism in any modern sense, but something. Something worth talking about for 2 hours on a slow night. So, let's begin at the beginning, or close enough to it. Let's start with the household, because the household is where everything starts. In Old Norse, the word for the woman who ran the household was húsfreyja, which translates more or less as house lady, or mistress of the house, not in the modern scandalous sense, in the managerial sense. The húsfreyja was, in practical terms, the chief operating officer of the farm. And in Viking Age Scandinavia, the farm was not just a place where food grew. It was the primary economic unit, the social unit, the political unit in many cases. The farm was everything. The farm was civilization, as far as most people were concerned. And the woman who ran it held real power. She had the keys, literally. The keys to the storage buildings, the chests, the locked rooms where the valuables were kept. Keys were not just practical objects in Viking society. They were symbolic. They were status. Archaeologists have found keys buried with women in graves across Scandinavia. Sometimes large, ornate keys that would have hung from belt fittings, visible to everyone, because visibility was the point. You could see, just by looking, that this woman was in charge of something. The húsfreyja managed the food stores. She organized the work of the household slaves. Yes, there were slaves. We'll get to that. And the free servants and the family members who worked the land. She supervised textile production, which was not a minor thing. Cloth was currency in the Viking Age, literally. A unit of woven wool fabric called vadmal was used as a standard of exchange in Iceland for centuries. When you made cloth, you were making money, and women made cloth. Spinning and weaving were not hobbies. They were skilled labor that directly supported the economic survival of the household. Every woman in a Viking household spun. A spindle whorl, the little weight at the bottom of the spindle, is one of the most commonly found artifacts in Viking Age archaeological sites. Thousands of them, in every size, every material, from simple soapstone to decorated bone to elegant bronze. Some of them found in graves, placed there with the woman who used them every day of her life. The loom was a different beast. Weaving on a Viking Age warp-weighted loom was genuinely skilled work. It took years to learn. The fabrics produced ranged from coarse everyday wool to fine tablet-woven braid, intricate geometric patterns in multiple colors used to decorate the hems and necklines of clothing. Some of the finest textile fragments found in Viking Age graves are astonishingly complex. The kind of thing that makes textile historians sit down very slowly and whisper. So the woman who ran the household was a manager, a keeper of resources, a producer of goods. She was also, in many cases, the person who knew where everything was. And in a society where the farm was the center of the world, that knowledge was genuinely powerful. Now, the husband. The husband, in the idealized Viking social model, was the bondi, the free farmer, the landholder. He worked the land, he managed the animals, he might go on trading voyages or occasional raiding expeditions, and when he was at home, he made decisions about the farm's larger direction. Whether to sell land, whether to build a new structure, what alliances to cultivate with neighboring farms. When he was home. The thing is, he was sometimes not home. Sometimes he was at the thing, the assembly, the local or regional governing body where disputes were settled and laws were proclaimed and men gathered to do politics. Sometimes he was on a trading voyage that could last months. Sometimes he went on a raid and came back with silver and a vague sense of satisfaction, and sometimes did not come back at all. During all of that time, the woman ran everything, and this was not considered unusual. This was the expected arrangement. A good wife, in Viking Age terms, was one who could manage the farm competently in her husband's absence. That was not a secondary quality. That was a core requirement. The sagas, the great prose narratives of medieval Iceland, many of which preserve material from the Viking Age, are full of women who make significant decisions, manage crises, and handle affairs while their husbands are conveniently elsewhere. Not because the husbands were useless, but because the world required both of them to function, and functioning often meant functioning in different spaces. We'll come back to the sagas a great deal tonight. They are our richest narrative source for understanding Viking Age life, even though they were written down in the 12th and 13th centuries and need to be handled with appropriate caution. They're not documentary, but they're not nothing either. They reflect social norms, social anxieties, and social ideals in ways that historians have been carefully unpacking for a very long time. Let's float gently toward one of those ideals, the ideal of the capable woman. There is a figure in Norse mythology who sort of encapsulates what Viking Age Scandinavians thought a woman should aspire to be, at least in her domestic role. Her name is Frigg. Frigg is the wife of Odin. She is the queen of the Aesir gods. She sits in her hall, Fensalir, and she spins. But she also knows things. She knows the fates of men. She knows the future. She doesn't always tell anyone what she knows, which is interesting. Frigg is associated with wisdom, with foresight, with the management of household and family, and with a kind of quiet knowing authority that doesn't need to shout. She is not a warrior goddess. That's Freyja, who is a completely different person and gets confused with Frigg constantly, which annoyed scholars for centuries. Frigg is something else. She is the competent woman in her hall, the keeper of knowledge. the one who sees what is coming and arranges things accordingly. That her primary implement is a spindle should tell you something about how spinning was viewed. Not as a diminished task, as a task so fundamental, so symbolically loaded, that the queen of the gods does it. Freyja, meanwhile, is doing entirely different things. Freyja is the goddess of love, of fertility, of magic, of war, and of the dead. She cries tears of gold when she misses her husband, who is frequently absent because he wanders. She practices a form of magic called seeress that we will spend considerable time on later in this script, because it is genuinely fascinating and a little strange and exactly the kind of thing that belongs in a 2-hour bedtime monologue about Viking women. But we'll get there. For now, let's stay on the ground. Let's stay on the farm. Because before we can understand what Viking women could do and what roles they held, we need to understand the legal framework they existed within. And that means talking about Norse law. Old Norse law was not a single unified code. Different regions had different legal traditions. Iceland had its own law, codified partly in the Gragas, the Grey Goose laws written down in the 12th century. Norway had regional law codes. Denmark had others. But there are some consistent features that appear across most of these traditions. And those features are worth dwelling on. The first thing to know is that Viking Age Scandinavian society was organized around the concept of kinship and the kin group. Your family was your legal unit. Your family was responsible for you, and you for them. If someone killed your kinsman, your family was entitled to vengeance or compensation. If you committed a crime, your family could be held liable. The bonds of kinship were legal, financial, and social. Women existed within these kinship structures, but not as passive objects. They had legal standing. A free woman in Viking Age Scandinavia was a legal person. She could own property. She could inherit. She could bring cases before the assembly. She could be the subject of legal protection. Now, her legal agency was not identical to a man's. There are significant constraints. Unmarried women of marriageable age were under the guardianship of their father or male relative. A concept called mundar governed the marriage transaction, which involved payments between families that acknowledged the transfer of a woman's legal guardianship from her birth family to her husband. This was transactional. Women were not property in any clean sense. But, and this is the part that makes Viking women somewhat distinctive relative to their European contemporaries. Marriage in Norse law was a two-way contract, not a one-way transfer. The woman's family retained interest. The woman herself retained some property. And crucially, Norse law, particularly Icelandic law, permitted women to divorce. Not easily, not without cost. But the provision was there. That is not nothing. Divorce in the Viking Age was not a simple matter. But the fact that it existed at all in a legally recognized form is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is genuinely unusual for this period. In most of medieval Christian Europe, marriage was a sacrament. It was indissoluble. Once you were married until death, barring some very specific and difficult to obtain ecclesiastical annulment. Women in Christian Europe had essentially no legal mechanism for leaving a bad marriage except dying in it, which many of them did, either from neglect, violence, childbirth, or simple bad luck. Viking Age Scandinavia, operating under pre-Christian Germanic legal traditions, had a different framework. Marriage was a contract. Contracts could be dissolved if the terms were not met. Now, what constituted grounds for divorce varied. The sources we have, mostly Icelandic law codes, list some specific grounds. A husband who failed to provide adequately for the household could be divorced for it. A husband who was chronically ill and unable to fulfill marital duties. A husband who struck his wife with his fist more than 3 times. That last one is uncomfortable because it implies that some striking was tolerable. But the limit itself is notable. There was a limit, it was written down, someone thought it mattered enough to specify. On the husband's side, grounds included infertility, a wife who wore masculine clothing, or a wife who was found publicly kissing another man. The standards were not symmetrical. They rarely are in this period. But both parties had some recourse. The procedure for divorce was also specific. The wife was supposed to announce the divorce in front of witnesses, typically at the bed, the marital bed, and then again at the door of the house, and again at the assembly. Public, witnessed, formal, not a quiet disappearance. A legal act. What happened to property after divorce was governed by the original marriage agreement. The woman typically reclaimed her dowry, the property she brought to the marriage. The husband's munder payment, the bride price he had given to her family, stayed with her family. Property accumulated during the marriage was divided according to whatever had been agreed originally. It was messy. It was imperfect. But women who left had some legal framework for taking their belongings with them, and some legal standing to do it in public. The sagas bear this out. There are multiple saga women who divorce their husbands, some dramatically, some with quiet efficiency. The most famous is probably Gudrun Osvifsdottir in Laxdæla Saga, who goes through 4 marriages over the course of the narrative, not all by choice, but partly by it. She is one of the most complex female characters in the saga literature. We will come back to her at some length later because she absolutely deserves the time. But first, let's take a small detour through the question of women's property. What could a Viking woman actually own? The short answer is quite a bit, depending on her social standing and circumstances. Unmarried women in their father's household had access to inheritance. Under most Norse legal traditions, daughters could inherit from their fathers, though they typically received less than sons. The division was not equal. Sons generally got the land. Daughters got movable wealth, but daughters got something. And in cases where there were no sons, daughters could inherit land. When a woman married, the property situation became more complicated. Her dowry was technically hers, but her husband managed it. This is the tricky bit. Management and ownership are legally distinct concepts, but in practice the line blurs. A husband who managed his wife's property could make decisions about it that she might not agree with, and her recourse was limited except in cases of outright misuse. However, married women in Iceland had a specific category of personal property that was genuinely their own. The kvennagang, women's goods, which included their clothing, jewelry, spinning and weaving equipment, and household items associated with their domestic role. These things were theirs. No one could take them. They were buried with women when they died. The grave goods archaeologists find in women's burials tell us a great deal about this. Women's graves from the Viking Age are often rich. Not always, not uniformly. There is enormous variation based on social status. But wealthy women were buried with their things. Their jewelry, their keys, their textiles, their tools, sometimes with horses, sometimes with ships. Yes, ships. There are women's graves with ships. The most famous is the Oseberg ship burial in Norway, dated to around 834 CE. 2 women were buried in it. The ship is magnificent, over 20 meters long, ornately carved, filled with objects that suggest these women had extraordinary status. Beds, wagons, tapestries, kitchen equipment, personal belongings. Who they were exactly is debated. One of them was older. She may have been in her 70s, based on skeletal analysis. The other was younger, perhaps in her 50s. The older woman shows signs of a conditions that would have caused her significant pain in life. She was treated with apparent care. She had a good bed, fine clothing, a powerful send-off. Some scholars think she may have been a queen. Some think she may have been a high-status völva, a seeress, a practitioner of the magic we'll discuss later. Either way, the ship burial signals that whatever she was in life, the people who buried her thought she was worth a very grand funeral. Let's talk about social hierarchy for a moment, because women's roles varied enormously depending on where they sat in it. Viking Age Scandinavian society was not egalitarian. Not by any stretch. At the top were kings and jarls, the ruling elite. Below them were the free farmers, the bondar, plural. And below them were the unfree, thralls, slaves, people who had been captured in raids or born into servitude. Women existed at every level of this hierarchy. A jarl's wife had enormous social prestige and real power within her household and her husband's social sphere. She could influence alliances, manage vast resources, receive guests and travelers on her husband's behalf, and act as a representative of her family's honor. A free farmer's wife had the domestic authority we've already discussed. Less glamorous, perhaps, but real. A slave woman had essentially nothing. She was property. She could be used sexually, sold, or killed with minimal legal consequence. Her children, if fathered by the master of the household, sometimes gained limited recognition, but not automatically. The condition of slavery was inheritable. Thrall women occupied the most precarious position in Viking Age society, and we should not gloss over that in a rush to celebrate the freedoms of higher status women. The contrast is important. When we talk about Viking women having legal rights, having property, having divorce options, we are talking about free women. Specifically, we're often talking about women with some social standing. The freedoms were real, but they were not universal. One more layer. Within free society, there was further gradation. The húsfreyja of a substantial farm was not the same as the wife of a poor bondi working a marginal plot of land on the edge of habitable territory. Status mattered. Connections mattered. The web of kinship and alliance shaped every woman's possibilities. Now let's talk about marriage itself. How it happened, how it was arranged, what it meant. Viking Age marriages were, for the most part, arranged by families. The parents, or specifically the male guardians, of both parties negotiated the terms. The bride price, the dowry, what property went where, what the conditions were. The woman's consent was, in principle, required. The law codes say this. The law codes specify that a woman could not be given in marriage against her will. In practice, of course, pressure was applied. Economic pressure, family pressure, the understanding that certain alliances were necessary. A daughter who refused a match her father had arranged was a complication that could be managed, but a complication nonetheless. But the formal requirement for consent is there. And the sagas, once again, show us cases where women refused matches, negotiated them, or influenced them significantly. These are not passive women being moved around like chess pieces, at least not always. Some of them maneuver quite aggressively within the constraints they have. The wedding itself was a multi-day event, a large feast. Specific rituals, the exchange of rings, the sharing of ale, the giving of gifts. The bride would be ceremonially conducted to the marriage bed with formal witnesses. The consummation was a legal event as much as a personal one, witnessed in the sense that people waited outside and then formally confirmed it had occurred. Very romantic, very 9th century. After the wedding, the bride moved to her husband's household. This was the norm. She left her birth family's farm and became the húsfreyja of her husband's. She brought her dowry with her. She brought her personal skills and connections. She became, in most practical senses, the manager of a new household. Her relationship with her mother-in-law, if the mother-in-law was still living, could be complicated. Viking Age sagas are full of domestic tensions between women in the same household. The older woman used to running things, the younger woman with a mandate to take over. Not always conflict, sometimes cooperation, passing of knowledge, mentorship, but sometimes conflict, sometimes spectacular conflict. We'll get to that. The sagas. If you want to understand Viking Age women, or Viking Age anything, you eventually have to sit with the sagas. There is no getting around them. They are our richest, most detailed, most narrative source for this world. A quick note on what the sagas are, for anyone who hasn't encountered them before. The Icelandic sagas are a body of prose literature, mostly written in the 12th and 13th centuries, mostly in Iceland. They cover a wide range of subjects. Some of them are histories of Norwegian kings, the Konungasögur, King's Sagas. Some of them are stories about legendary figures, the Fornaldarsögur, sagas of ancient times, full of dragons and magic, and people with more than human abilities. And some of them are the Íslendingasögur, the sagas of Icelanders, which deal with the lives and conflicts of Icelandic families in the period, roughly from the settlement of Iceland in the late 9th century to the early 11th. The family sagas are the ones we'll spend the most time with tonight, because they are the ones that depict women in the most detailed and psychologically interesting ways. They are not purely historical documents. They were written down centuries after the events they describe by Christian authors in a context where society had changed considerably. But they preserve older oral traditions, older legal frameworks, older social values imperfectly through layers of reinterpretation, but preserve them nonetheless. And the women in them are remarkable. Let's start with one of the most famous, Other Djupúðga, the Deep-Minded, or, if you prefer the variation, Odd the Deep-Minded. She appears in several sagas, most prominently in Laxdæla Saga and Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements. She was, according to tradition, a Norwegian noblewoman of the 9th century who ended up as one of the principal settlers of Iceland. Her story, as the sagas tell it, is one of successive losses and successive adaptations. She was married to a Norse king in Dublin because, yes, there were Norse kings in Dublin. The Viking Age was sprawling and complicated, and Ireland was very much involved. Her husband died. Her son, Thorstein, carved out territory in Scotland but was killed there. And Odd, rather than accepting whatever fate the death of her male protectors might bring, took action. She had a ship built in secret. At night, according to Laxdæla Saga, a characteristically dramatic touch. She assembled the members of her household and a group of freed slaves and sailed away. She went first to the Orkney Islands, then to the Faroe Islands, then to Iceland. She was among the earliest settlers of Iceland. She claimed land in the west, in Dalir, and she distributed it to her followers, including, specifically, to freed slaves. She gave them land. In the 9th century, this is the kind of detail that makes historians want to pause and appreciate it, because it is genuinely unusual. She is also said to have converted to Christianity, which would make her one of the very few early Icelandic settlers to have done so. This was before Iceland officially converted in 1000 CE. Whether this is historically accurate or a later interpolation by Christian saga authors is debated. But the image of her praying alone on a hill, apart from her household, because her faith was private to her, has a quiet dignity about it that has stuck in the literature. When she died, at a feast she herself had organized, at an advanced age, after giving away her granddaughter in a splendid marriage. She died in her bed that night, apparently at the moment of her choosing. The saga says she died sitting upright, which to the saga author was a sign of her exceptional character. She controlled herself to the end. She was buried in a ship, as she had requested, with her personal belongings. A great mound was raised over her. Odd the Deep-Minded, a widow who built her own ship and sailed across the North Atlantic because she had things left to do. She is not the only saga woman worth spending time on. Let's talk about Gudrun Osvifsdóttir, the protagonist of Laxdæla Saga in a much more central sense. Laxdæla Saga is, broadly speaking, a love tragedy. It involves multiple generations of a family in western Iceland, and at its center is Gudrun, beautiful, intelligent, ambitious, and fatally complicated. She has a dream at the beginning of the saga. She goes to a seer and describes it. She dreams of 4 headdresses, a hood, a silver headdress, a gold headdress, a golden helmet, and each one falls into water. The seer interprets them as 4 husbands. Each one will be lost. This is how the saga sets her up. From the very beginning, you know things are not going to go well. But you read anyway, because Gudrun herself is too interesting to look away from. Her first husband is chosen for her, and she divorces him. She uses the Norse divorce provisions quite formally, citing grounds that boil down to the marriage not working for her. She just ends it. The saga is almost casual about this. She ends the marriage. The ex-husband is embarrassed. He leaves Iceland entirely. Done. Her second marriage ends in death, her third in drowning, her fourth in the terrible complications of her connection to a man she loved and could not have. Kjartan Ólafsson, who was her great love, who she lost through a cascade of misunderstandings and pride, and the complex machinery of saga honor culture. The relationship between Gudrun and Kjartan is the heart of the saga. They loved each other. They were separated. Kjartan went abroad to Norway, and Gudrun expected him to return and marry her. He stayed away too long. She married someone else. He came back and married someone else. The wound between them was never healed, and it led, through a series of escalating provocations and retaliations, to Kjartan's death, engineered, or at least permitted, by Gudrun. She married Kjartan's killer. She managed the consequences. She outlived several more tragedies. And at the end of her life, when her son asked her whom she had loved most, she gave an answer that has been quoted and requoted for centuries. Him I treated worst. She meant Kjartan, the one she had loved most, the one she had, in some sense, helped to kill. That answer, that quiet, devastating answer. It is the end of the saga and the end of Gudrun's story in the narrative. And it is one of the most economical summaries of a complicated life that medieval literature produced. She is not a saint. She is not a victim. She is someone who made choices, loved fiercely, acted from pride and passion, and lived with the consequences. That is what makes her a saga character rather than a figure from hagiography. Let's drift toward another kind of woman now. Let's talk about the Skjaldmær, the Shield-Maiden. This is where things get complicated in a different way, because the Shield-Maiden is both a real cultural concept in Norse literature and mythology, and a figure who has been enormously romanticized and distorted by later centuries and, more recently, by television. In Old Norse literature, the Skjaldmær is a woman who takes up weapons and fights. She appears in the legendary sagas, the Fornaldarsögur, and in heroic poetry. Hervor, in the Hervarisay saga, is one of the most famous. She fights, she claims a cursed sword from her dead father's burial mound. She does things that women in the family sagas don't do. She is a figure of myth as much as history. In the historical sagas, the family sagas, the king's sagas, women fighting is far less common. It happens in moments of crisis. A woman defending her home when there are no men present. A woman striking a blow in a moment of anger or desperation. But systematic female warriors, women who fight as a profession or a chosen identity, are mostly absent from the historical narrative sources. This does not mean they did not exist. The evidence is genuinely contested. There is a grave from Birka in Sweden, one of the great Viking Age trading towns that was excavated in the 19th century and assumed for over 100 years to be the grave of a male warrior. The skeleton surrounded by weapons, sword, arrows, shields, gaming pieces, 2 horses, classic warrior burial. In 2017, genetic analysis confirmed the skeleton was biologically female. The internet had opinions about this, loud opinions. The response from scholars was more nuanced. The grave is real. The weapons are real. The biological sex of the skeleton is, as far as current analyses can determine, female. Whether this means this individual identified as a woman, was a warrior, was buried with someone else's weapons for symbolic reasons, was a high-status woman whose weapons were emblematic of her authority, rather than her personal use. These are all questions that the grave cannot answer on its own. What the Birka grave does tell us, firmly, is that we should not assume weapons mean male, that the people who buried this individual surrounded her with martial objects and saw nothing contradictory about that. Whatever she was in life, in death she was accompanied by the full equipment of a fighter. That is meaningful, even if we can't resolve every question. Now, the völva. This is one of the most fascinating and genuinely well-documented female roles in Viking Age in Scandinavia, and it deserves its own sustained attention, which it is going to get right now. A völva, plural völur, was a seeress, a practitioner of seer magic, a woman who was believed to have the ability to perceive hidden truths, see futures, communicate with other realms, and work changes in the world through magical practice. She traveled. This is one of the most consistent elements of what we know about völur. Unlike the húsfreyja, who was rooted in her household, the völva moved. She went from farm to farm, community to community. People invited her, hosted her, fed her, asked her questions. In return, she performed her craft. The most detailed description of a völva in action comes from Erik's Saga, Erik the Red Saga, which is one of the Vinland sagas, the stories of Norse exploration to North America. In it, there is a woman named Thorbjörg, who is described as a little völva, a little seeress or minor völva. The diminutive is interesting. It implies a hierarchy. There are bigger ones. Thorbjörg arrives at a farm in Greenland during a period of hardship and famine. The farmer's household prepares for her with specific, careful attention. She is given a special place to sit, a high seat with a cushion stuffed with hen's feathers. She is fed a specific meal, porridge made from goat's milk, and a dish prepared from the hearts of the various kinds of animals available. She carries a staff with a brass knob. She wears specific clothing described in detail, a cloak with stones on it, glass beads at her neck, a hood lined with cat fur, catskin boots, and gloves. She carries a bag at her waist, presumably containing her working materials. The next day, she performs her working. She needs people to sing the specific songs that will attract the spirits she works with. Varðlokkar, spirit-calling songs. A young woman in the household knows these songs. She learned them from her foster mother. Thorbjörg sits on her high seat and the songs are sung, and the seeress does her work, and she answers the questions the community has brought to her. She answers questions about the famine, about when it will end, about the young woman who sang the songs, what her future holds. The scene is matter-of-fact in the saga. Nobody finds it strange. Nobody protests that this is wrong or dangerous. It is simply a service that this woman provides, and the community receives it with formal respect. What Thorbjörg actually does, what the seer practice involved, is described in various sources with varying degrees of clarity. The most consistent elements seem to involve an altered state of consciousness, something trance-like, and a focus on perception and knowledge rather than direct magical action. The seeress sees. She perceives things others cannot. She can communicate this perception to those who ask. Other uses of seers described in the sources are more active, influencing the luck of people, affecting the weather, cursing, or protecting. But the central function in the majority of sources is seeing. Seer and its relationship to gender is one of the most interesting and debated topics in Old Norse studies, because seer was associated in complex ways with femininity, and its practice by men was considered deeply transgressive. The word ergi, a term of profound insult in Old Norse, referred to a man who was passive in sexual terms, or who took on feminine roles or characteristics. It was one of the worst things you could call someone. A man called arger, the adjective form, could legally kill the person who said it to him, so seriously was it taken. And seir, when practiced by men, was associated with ergi. Even Odin, the chief of the gods, the All-Father himself, practices seir. He learned it from Freyja, the sources tell us, and the sources acknowledge that this association with ergi applies to Odin too. Odin, the great god, the master of magic, was considered in some sense to have compromised his masculine status through this practice. He did it anyway because the power was worth the cost in his calculus. But the stigma was real. Why was Seidr gendered feminine? Scholars have proposed various explanations. The association with passivity. The seeress sits, receives, perceives rather than acting outwardly. The association with spinning. The manipulation of fate was sometimes conceptualized as a kind of spinning, a winding of threads. The association with Freyja, its divine originator. Probably some combination of all of these. What matters for our purposes is that this powerful magical practice was primarily, normatively, female, and that women who practiced it held a recognized and respected social role. The völva was not a witch in the negative medieval European sense. She was a professional, a specialist, someone you hired when you needed to know things. She was also, potentially, a figure of real social power. She knew things about people. She had performed her workings across many households, across many generations. She had a network of connection. People who had hosted her, people who owed her obligations of hospitality, people whose futures she had perceived, and whose secrets she carried. An itinerant völva with a long career was, in a sense, a walking repository of information about the social landscape. That is power of a particular kind, quiet, distributed, not easily challenged. The Nornir, the Norns, are the mythological reflection of this concept. The Norns are three figures who sit at the well at the root of Yggdrasil, the world tree, and spin and weave the threads of fate. Urther, Verðandi, and Skuld, roughly. That which was, that which is becoming, that which shall be. Past, present, future. They cut the threads when the time comes. When a thread is cut, a life ends. They are not personal. They are not malicious. They are simply the machinery of fate, doing what fate does, which is run. You cannot bargain with them. You can know what they have spun if you have the perception to see it. But you cannot change it. Or can you? This is actually a point of genuine debate in the mythological tradition. Some sources suggest that Seidr can manipulate fate, that the Velsva's practice can shift the threads, change outcomes, redirect the weaving. This is what makes Seidr alarming to some people in the sources. Not just that it perceives fate, but that it touches it, which is, of course, why it's powerful, and why it belongs to women, because women were associated, in this cosmology, with fate itself. Let's shift the setting a little. Let's leave the farm. Let's go to the market. Viking Age Scandinavia was not isolated. It was the opposite. The Norse people were, among other things, extraordinary traders. They had trading networks that stretched from the British Isles to the Byzantine Empire, from Iceland to the Caspian Sea. The Varangian trade routes along the rivers of what is now Russia and Ukraine connected Scandinavia to Constantinople and Baghdad. Scandinavian traders carried furs, amber, walrus ivory, and slaves to markets in the east and south, and brought back silver, silk, spices, and glass. Women participated in this trade, not, for the most part, as independent merchants sailing long ships into the Black Sea, though we cannot rule this out entirely for every individual, but as producers, as managers, and in the context of the trading towns, as active participants in market economies. Hedeby, Birka, Kaupang. The great Viking Age trading centers were cosmopolitan, diverse, and economically complex. People from across the Norse world and beyond gathered there. And the archaeological evidence from these sites includes evidence of women's presence at every social level, from the graves of wealthy women, surrounded by imported goods, to the modest spindle, whorls, and needle cases that indicate domestic work. Cloth, again, is central. The production of vadmal, the standard weight woven wool that functioned as currency, was a female industry. Women who produced cloth in quantity were producing wealth. The connections between the household textile economy and the broader trade economy were direct. A farm that produced excellent cloth had something to sell. There is also evidence that some women were involved in the craft economies of trading towns. Bead making, which was a significant industry in Viking Age Scandinavia. Those glass beads that adorned the necks of high-status women were manufactured locally as well as imported, shows evidence of female involvement. Some craft production appears to have been primarily female. What about women who actually traveled on trading voyages? The evidence here is more elusive. The sagas mention women on ships occasionally, sometimes accompanying their husbands, sometimes in narratives of emigration to Iceland or Greenland or Vinland. Odd the Deep-Minded, as we've seen, commanded her own ship. The Vinland sagas include women in the expeditions to North America. Gudrid Thorbjarnardottir, one of the most extraordinary figures in the Norse exploration narratives, who traveled to Vinland, gave birth to a child there, the first European child born in the Americas, if the tradition is correct, and later walked to Rome on pilgrimage. Gudrid is worth pausing on. She appears in both Eirik's Saga Reda and Grænlendinga Saga, and her life as the sagas present it is genuinely remarkable. She was born in Iceland, traveled to Greenland, survived a difficult winter and a plague that killed many of her companions, was present for the death of a völva. The Thorbjorg we discussed earlier appears in her story. Married twice, sailed to Vinland, had a child there, returned to Iceland after her husband's death, made the pilgrimage to Rome, came back to Iceland, became a nun, and was regarded with such honor that her descendants included bishops. She traveled, in other words, constantly and extensively across a remarkable portion of the medieval world. And she did it partly through the specific mechanisms of Norse society, through marriage alliances, through the networks of the exploring families, through her own evident competence and adaptability. Her story is preserved imperfectly through sagas written centuries later, but it has a consistency across multiple sources that suggests a real historical person at its core. A woman who moved. The Norse colonization of Iceland, Greenland, and briefly North America was a family project. Men and women went together in ships, sometimes with children, sometimes with livestock. The sagas of settlement, Landnámabók, list hundreds of settlers, and a meaningful proportion of them are women. Women who claimed land in their own names. Women who founded farms that became the homes of families remembered in sagas for generations. The settlement of Iceland in particular, from roughly 870 to 930 CE, was a mass migration from Norway, and to a lesser extent Ireland, the Hebrides, and other areas with Norse populations. It was driven partly by political pressures. Harald Fairhair's consolidation of Norway into a single kingdom pushed many independent-minded farmers to seek land elsewhere, and partly by the simple reality that there was new land available, and Scandinavians were very good at finding and exploiting new land. Women who came to Iceland came as wives, daughters, and sisters of settlers. They also came as thralls, enslaved women, many of them Irish or Scottish, taken in raids on the British Isles. The genetic evidence from modern Icelanders is interesting on this point. The Y chromosome DNA, paternally inherited, shows strongly Scandinavian ancestry, while the mitochondrial DNA, maternally inherited, shows significant British Isles admixture. This is consistent with a settlement pattern where free Norsemen came with enslaved women from the British Isles, who then had children who were Icelandic. That's a sad statistic, but it is a real one, and it matters for understanding the full picture of women's experiences in the Viking Age. Not all of them were free. Not all of them chose to be where they were. Let's return to the household for a while. Let's talk about children. Children in Viking Age Scandinavia were, legally speaking, not yet full members of society until they were formally accepted by their father. A newborn infant was placed on the ground, Jordsetning, setting on the earth, and the father could choose to pick it up and name it, formally accepting it into the family and giving it legal standing. Or he could order it exposed, left outside to die. Infant exposure was legal in pre-Christian Scandinavia. It was not, we should note, common. The majority of infants were wanted and kept. But the practice existed, and it fell to the father to make the decision. The mother had no legal say in this particular moment. This is one of the darker aspects of the legal framework, and we should not minimize it. A woman who had just given birth had no legal protection for child in that immediate moment, her husband decided. After that moment, however, the picture shifts. A named child was protected. It was a member of the family, with all the kinship obligations that implied, and the mother was its primary caregiver, its educator in the domestic arts, its main daily presence. Mothers nursed their children, usually for extended periods. The sagas mention nursing children of 2 or 3 years old without treating it as remarkable. In elite households, wet nurses were sometimes employed, but this was not universal. The bond between mother and child in the sagas is consistently depicted as intense and enduring. The relationship between mothers, and sons in particular, is a major element of saga literature. Sons were their mother's advocates and executors of vengeance. A mother who was wronged expected her sons to act. A mother who wanted action taken could encourage, shame, and pressure her sons into it. The image of the mother who hands her son his weapons and tells him to go avenge his father, or her honor, or the family's name, is a recurring saga motif. This is sometimes called the incitement motif, vöt in Old Norse. Women incite men to action through words, through emotional pressure, through appeals to honor and obligation. It has been discussed at great length by scholars of the sagas. Some see it as evidence of women's indirect power. They cannot act directly, so they motivate men who can. Others see it as a reflection of genuine female agency, operating within the constraints of a society that had specific channels for action, and this was one of them. It is probably both. Most things are both. Let's talk about the education of daughters. A Viking Age girl learned, from her mother and the other women of the household, everything she would need to run a household herself. Spinning, weaving, textile finishing, dyeing, cooking, brewing, food preservation, dairy work, the management of cows and goats, the making of butter and cheese and skyr, the fermented dairy product that is still made in Iceland today and has experienced a rather remarkable 21st century revival on the international yogurt market. Somewhat off topic, but it's a pleasant detail. She also learned social skills, how to receive guests, how to serve at table with appropriate dignity, how to navigate the complex social hierarchies of a household and its connections. The management of relationships was a skill, and it was taught. If she came from an elite family, she might also learn reading and writing in runes, not Latin letters, which were a Christian and ecclesiastical thing, but the runic alphabet, which was used for shorter inscriptions, messages, memorial stones. There are runic inscriptions associated with women, women who commission them, women who carve them, women who are named in them. Literacy, in this sense, was not exclusively male. She might also learn the stories, the mythological narratives, the family histories, the sagas in their oral forms before they were ever written down. Memory and recitation were valuable skills, and women were part of the tradition that preserved them. The ideal young woman in the Viking Age Norse conception was competent, dignified, capable of managing complex affairs, skilled in textiles, knowledgeable about household management, and socially adept. She was not expected to be passive or silent. She was expected to be able to take care of things. This is a different ideal from, say, the medieval Christian ideal of feminine virtue, which tended to emphasize passivity, obedience, and silence as primary virtues. The Norse ideal was more operational. Good women did things. The relationship between women and food is worth a brief detour. The húsfreyja controlled the food stores, and food in the Viking Age was existentially important in a way that modern people in comfortable circumstances can easily underestimate. Scandinavia is not an easy agricultural environment. The growing season is short. Winters are long and cold. Food preservation, the ability to have enough stored grain, dried fish, preserved meat, fermented dairy, and other foodstuffs to survive from harvest to the next harvest, was literally a matter of life and death. The woman who managed the food stores held, in this context, a real kind of power over the survival of the household. A húsfreyja, who managed well-kept people alive. One who managed badly could mean genuine hardship. This is not a small thing. The brewing of ale also fell to women in Viking Age households. Ale was the daily drink. Water sources were not always reliable, and fermented beverages were both caloric and safer to drink than untreated water in many circumstances. The ability to produce good ale was a valued domestic skill. Mead, fermented honey, was more elaborate and associated with feasting and high-status occasions. The production of both was female work. The saga of Eric the Red includes a detail about Gudrid that I always find charming. When she is introduced early in the narrative, she is helping to prepare food for a feast. She is not yet a major figure. She is just competent, present, doing her part. And then over the course of the saga, she becomes this extraordinary traveler, this resilient survivor, this woman who outlives everyone and walks to Rome and comes back and becomes a nun. But in the beginning, she's just making dinner. There's something grounding about that. By now, if you are still awake, you are doing well. We're well into the second hour, and there is still a great deal to explore. Let's talk about what we can learn from the ground itself. Archaeology is one of our most important sources for Viking Age women because it bypasses the filter of literary tradition entirely. A grave doesn't lie about what was placed in it, even if we argue about what those things mean. A woman buried with keys actually had keys. A woman buried with a spindle and a sword actually had a spindle and a sword. The objects are real. Viking Age burial practices varied significantly across time and region. The practice of cremation was common, particularly in the early Viking Age. The dead were burned, sometimes on ships, sometimes on pyres, and the remains were buried with grave goods. Inhumation, burial of the intact body, was also practiced and becomes more common over time and with increasing Christian influence. Both types of burial have yielded evidence of women's lives. The cremated remains are harder to analyze physically, but the objects that survived the fire tell stories. The inhumations, where skeletal remains are preserved, allow biological analysis, age, health, physical characteristics, and in recent years, ancient DNA. What do the graves tell us? They tell us that high-status women were buried with considerable wealth. Jewelry, brooches, necklaces, arm rings, rings, is the most common marker. The oval brooches that characterized Norse female dress, worn in pairs at the shoulders to fasten the straps of an overdress, are one of the most distinctive and frequently found Viking Age artifacts. They range from simple bronze to elaborate silver with complex decoration, and their quality reflects social status clearly. Beyond jewelry, wealthy women's graves contain imported goods: Byzantine silk, Arabic silver coins, glass beads from the Rhineland. The cosmopolitan reach of Viking Age trade made itself felt in the graves of elite women in remote Scandinavian farms. These women wore silk from Constantinople, carried beads from Germany, used bronze scales from somewhere far away. What this tells us is that wealthy Viking Age women were not isolated from the wider world. They were connected to it through their husbands' trading networks, through gifts and exchange, through the flow of luxury goods along the trade routes. They were visible consumers of prestige goods in ways that marked their social status and their household's connections. The graves also tell us about what women did in life. the association of specific tools with specific genders in burial is strong enough to be reliable as a general indicator. Weaving swords, the flat tools used to beat the weft in tablet weaving, are almost exclusively found in women's graves. Sewing needles and needle cases, spindle whorls, shears for cutting cloth. These tools mark women's work. Keys, as mentioned earlier, mark women's authority. Sometimes a single key, sometimes a ring with multiple keys, suggesting management of multiple locked spaces. Cooking equipment, pots, cauldrons, ladles, sometimes appears in women's graves, though also in men's. It marks involvement in food preparation. And sometimes, as in the Birka case, weapons. The Birka warrior grave is not unique. There are a small number of other graves that complicate the simple gender binary in burial. A woman buried with a horse and riding equipment. A woman buried with a knife and an axe along with her textile tools. These cases are fewer than the normative pattern, but they exist, and they resist simple explanation. The most honest interpretation is probably that Viking Age people buried their dead according to identity and status as they understood them, and that some individuals' identities did not fit the standard binary categories any more than some individuals' identities do today, or that the categories themselves were somewhat more flexible than our retrospective imposition of rigid gender roles might suggest. Runes are another kind of evidence. Let's float that direction. The runic alphabet, the Futhark, named for its first 6 letters, was used in Scandinavia from at least the 2nd century CE and continued in use through the Viking Age and well into the medieval period. In the Viking Age, the form used was the younger Futhark, a simplified 16-character alphabet used for a variety of purposes: memorial stones, personal objects, messages, magical inscriptions. Women appear in rune stones in 3 ways. First, as the deceased remembered. Memorial rune stones. The great raised stones with runic inscriptions that mark significant graves or commemorate the dead, often commemorate women. Ranghildr raised this stone for, or in memory of Name, the best of women. These inscriptions are brief but meaningful. They tell us women were considered worth memorializing in permanent stone. Second, as the people who commissioned the stones. A significant number of rune stones were raised by women, mothers for sons, wives for husbands, daughters for fathers. The commission of a memorial stone was an act of public commemoration, an assertion of grief and relationship, a permanent mark on the landscape. Women who did this were not passive grievers. They were making statements. Third, as carvers. There are a small number of inscriptions that appear to have been carved by women, or that name women as carvers. The evidence is limited and debated, but it exists. Women were, at minimum, literate in runes in some cases, and in some contexts. One of the most interesting rune stones for our purposes is one of the Hillersjö stones from Sweden, which records a complex genealogy in which property passes through a woman named Gerlug. She inherits from her son, and then manages the inheritance. The stone is about property and legal succession, and a woman is at the center of it, not as a passive recipient, but as a legal actor, whose decisions are worth recording in stone. Around the year 1000, Iceland officially converted to Christianity. The conversion happened at the Althing, the National Assembly, in a pragmatic compromise that allowed those who wished to continue practicing the old religion to do so privately. Publicly, Iceland was now Christian. Norway converted under Olaf Tryggvason, and later Olaf Haraldsson, not always peacefully. Sweden held out longer. The conversion of Scandinavia was a gradual and complicated process, not a single event. And the conversion changed things for women, not all in the same direction. On one hand, Christianity brought with it an institutional structure, the church, that provided women with new roles. Convents were eventually established. Women could become nuns, could participate in religious life in formal ways, could have access to literacy and learning in ecclesiastical contexts. For women who found the household life constraining, the convent offered an alternative. Some women became quite powerful in ecclesiastical contexts. Abbesses ran significant institutions, controlled property, and wielded influence over religious and secular affairs. This was an option that pre-Christian Norse society did not offer in quite the same way, though the völva was a kind of analog in terms of a specialized female religious role outside of marriage. On the other hand, Christianity brought a very different theology of gender. The Church's teaching on women's nature, women's role, and women's relationship to sin was not favorable. Eve as the origin of the fall, women as the weaker sex, more susceptible to temptation, requiring guidance and control. The elevation of virginity as the highest female virtue, which sat uneasily with a society that valued women as wives and mothers and household managers. Christian marriage law replaced Norse divorce customs. Under canon law, marriage was indissoluble. The divorce provisions that Norse law had allowed, imperfect, limited, but real, disappeared. Women who had had legal recourse to leave a bad marriage lost it. The emphasis on female chastity and the association of female sexuality with danger and corruption introduced anxieties that Norse pre-Christian culture had not quite had in the same form. The völva's sexuality, she was not expected to be celibate, the sources don't suggest this, became more problematic under Christian framing. Women who practiced seeress became witches. The word is different, and so are the implications. The shift was gradual. Old customs persisted under Christian veneers for generations. But over the course of the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries, the legal and social position of Scandinavian women moved closer to the European Christian norm, which was, broadly, more restrictive. This is one of the reasons why the Icelandic saga literature, written in the Christian period, is such an interesting and complicated source. The authors who wrote these sagas were Christians. They were educated men, probably mostly clerics or people with clerical education. They were writing about a pagan past from a Christian present, and they preserved, whether out of cultural pride, genuine historical interest, or narrative appeal, stories of women who did things that Christian theology would have found problematic. Gudrun Osvifsdottir, who divorced and maneuvered and loved and arranged death. Odd the deep-minded, who prayed to a Christian god while running a pagan ship burial for herself. The Volur, who perceived fate and moved through the world on their own authority. The saga authors didn't always approve of these women. The texts sometimes signaled disapproval through framing and commentary. But they preserved the stories anyway, and the women in them remain alive on the page 8 or 9 centuries later. That is something. Let's talk about poetry. Old Norse skaldic poetry is one of the most complex and technically demanding literary forms ever developed. The meters are intricate, the kennings, metaphorical compound words that substitute for direct nouns, are elaborate and elusive. The references require extensive knowledge of mythology and heroic tradition. Skaldic poetry was a prestige art form. Skalds were valued members of royal courts. A good skald could make a king famous. A bad review from a skald was genuinely socially dangerous. Were there female skalds? There are a small number of verses attributed to women in the sources. Not many. The tradition was primarily male in the court context, but they exist. One of the most interesting is a verse attributed to a woman named Jorunn Skaldmare. Jorunn the Shield-Maiden or Poet Maiden. The epithet itself is remarkable. She is called specifically a female poet. This is her identity as the sources remember her. She composed a drapa, a formal praise poem, for the Norwegian king Haraldr Harfagri, Harold Fairhair. This was the high-status kind of skaldic poetry, the kind performed at courts, the kind that required real technical skill. That she was remembered for this, that the epithet Skaldmare was attached to her name as a permanent identifier, suggests she was genuinely notable, not a curiosity. a practitioner. There are other names. Steingerd, who appears in the Cormac saga as the object of a skald's obsessive love poetry, is also credited with verse of her own. Verse pushes back against the objectification that asserts her own perspective. Heidrun, in some traditions. Scattered references to women who composed. The tradition of women's verse may have been more developed than the surviving record suggests. Skaldic poetry survives because it was preserved in manuscripts, mostly by male scribes in Christian Iceland. Verse by women may have been less systematically preserved. What we have may be a fraction. There is also a different kind of poetry that is more firmly associated with women. The mansanger, which translates roughly as women's songs or love songs. These were shorter, less technically elaborate, associated with personal expression and emotion rather than formal court praise. They were not highly valued in the literary hierarchy. The sagas sometimes mention them with mild condescension. But they existed, and they were understood as a female genre. The contrast is interesting. The high-status formal poetry was primarily male. The lower-status personal poetry was associated with women. And yet women occasionally crossed the line and composed in the high forms. Because of course they did. The Eddic poetry, the mythological and heroic poems collected in the Poetic Edda, gives us women's voices in a different context. The heroic poems in particular, which deal with figures like the Valkyrie Brynhildr and the tragic heroine Gudrun, different from the Gudrun of Laxdæla saga. This one belongs to the Germanic heroic tradition shared with the German Nibelungenlied, are full of women speaking, arguing, lamenting, making declarations of love and vengeance. Brynhildr in the Eddic tradition is one of the most complex figures. She is a Valkyrie, a divine female figure associated with battle, with choosing the slain, with carrying warriors to Valhalla. She is also a woman who was deceived, who married the wrong man because the right man was given a potion that made him forget her, and who drove the machinery of vengeance that destroyed them all. She is not passive, not for a single line. She argues with Gudrun, the famous flyting, the verbal duel between the two women over whose husband is greater, and it is one of the most dramatic scenes in the entire mythological corpus. Two women shouting at each other in the river where they're washing their hair, each claiming superiority through their husband's prestige. It ends with revelation, betrayal, and the eventual deaths of multiple people. The flyting, the verbal contest, the insulting exchange, was taken seriously as a cultural form in the Norse world. The ability to speak well in an argument was a valued skill, and the Eddic tradition places women squarely in this tradition. Brynhildr can flyting with anyone. Let's spend some time with the Valkyries. Because they are one of the most persistent images from Norse mythology, and their actual nature in the original sources is genuinely interesting. The word Valkyria means truer of the slain, Val the slain, the fallen, Kyria, chooser. Their function is to move across battlefields, selecting which warriors will die and which will live, and to carry the chosen dead to Valhalla, Odin's hall of the honored dead. This is their supernatural function. But the Valkyries are also, in the Eddic poems, depicted as individuals, named women with personalities, desires, and fates. They fall in love. They make choices for personal reasons. They are punished for disobedience and rescued by heroes, and sometimes become human women who live human lives. Brynhildr, already mentioned. She disobeys Odin. She grants victory to the wrong king in battle, the one Odin did not choose to win. She is punished by being placed in an enchanted sleep on a fire-ringed mountain, to be woken by a man fearless enough to ride through the flames. That man is Sigurður, the great hero of the cycle. He wakes her, they fall in love, he eventually forgets her due to a magical draft, and marries someone else, and a catastrophe follows. Her mistake was autonomy. She made a choice on the battlefield that was not sanctioned. She had a reason, The king she chose deserved to win in her judgment. But judgment is not hers to exercise independently. It belongs to Odin. The punishment is forced passivity, literal suspension, the frozen sleep. When she wakes, she is herself again, forceful, intelligent, magnificent, and furious. The rest of the cycle is partly the story of her fury. There is a lot going on in Brynhildr. She is one of the most analyzed figures in Old Norse scholarship, and scholars keep finding things in her. A reflection of the tension between women's perceived desire for autonomy and the social structures that constrain it. A critique of the marriage system. A meditation on fate and free will. A just genuinely compelling character who didn't deserve what happened to her, which is probably why she resonates. The other Valkyrie who gets a great deal of narrative attention is Sigrun. From the poems about Helgi Hundingsbane, she is the classic Valkyrie as lover figure. She sees the hero, falls in love, helps him in battle, eventually rides with him to Valhalla. Her story is more romantic and less tragic than Brynhildr's, though not without sadness. What is interesting about these figures is what they suggest about the Norse imagination of women and power. The Valkyries are powerful. They move through the world without restriction. They make decisions, including life and death decisions. They choose, but they are specifically supernatural. The power is purtismissile because these are not normal women. They are divine or semi-divine. The moment a Valkyrie starts to live a human life, when she marries, when she settles down, the supernatural freedom ends. She becomes a woman among women with a woman's constraints. The boundary between the extraordinary and the ordinary is policed in these myths. Extraordinary women are possible, but they exist in a separate category. Bringing them into the human world requires transformation, which usually involves loss of power. There is something uncomfortable about that pattern. It acknowledges the appeal of female freedom and power. The Valkyries are cool. They're meant to be admired, while safely containing it in the realm of the supernatural, the exceptional, the categorically different. Let's talk about politics. Specifically, let's talk about the Thing. The Thing was the assembly. Every Viking Age Scandinavian community had some form of assembly. Local assemblies, Heraðsþing, regional assemblies, and in Iceland, the great national assembly, the Althing, which met every summer at Thingvellir, in a remarkable open-air legislative and judicial gathering. The Thing was where disputes were settled, laws were proclaimed, cases were tried, alliances were made and broken, and the political life of the community happened. It was, in short, the center of public power. Could women attend the Thing? Yes. Women could be present at the Thing. They could bring cases as plaintiffs and witnesses. They could testify. They could speak, with certain limitations. Could women vote at the Thing in the sense of having formal political weight? No, not in the same way free men did. The formal legislative and judicial power was in the hands of Gothar, chieftains who were exclusively male, and free men who participated in decisions. Women were present, but not in the same formal civic role, however. The Thing was also a social event. It lasted 2 weeks in Iceland. People camped at Thingvellir in temporary booths, traded, socialized, arranged marriages, conducted business. The informal networks of the assembly, the conversations, the negotiations, the relationship building, were not exclusively male spaces. Women were there, they talked, they influenced, they carried information. And in cases involving their own interests, property disputes, divorce proceedings, inheritance, women had direct legal standing to speak. The law required their presence and their statement in certain contexts. The saga Njal's saga, the long, complex saga of the great lawman Njal and the events surrounding him, is full of women at the Thing. Bergthora, Njal's wife, Hallgerður, the wife of Gunnar, women whose words and decisions at the assembly have legal weight and narrative significance. Hallgerður, in particular, is one of the most discussed women in the saga literature. She is not a sympathetic figure. The saga takes pains to mark her as the cause of much of the disaster in the narrative. Through her pride and her encouragement of violent action, she was married 3 times, her first 2 husbands dying violently. She is described as beautiful and manipulative and fundamentally dangerous. But she is also a woman of real social presence. She attends the things, she speaks, she influences. She is not silenced or hidden. Her power in the narrative, to cause harm, to escalate conflict, is a reflection of the real social power that she, as a high-status húsfreyja, would have wielded. The fact that the saga uses her as a negative example doesn't remove the evidence of her power. It just tells us that the saga author was more comfortable attributing that power to bad motivations. Let's float toward one more saga woman before we move on. Let's talk briefly about Author of Laxdæla saga. Not Odd the Deep-Minded, a different author, actually. Let's talk about a woman from a different saga entirely. Let's talk about Þuríður Ólafsdóttir, Thurid. She appears in our Birka saga, which is set in the Snæfellsnes region of Iceland. She is a widow who runs her farm independently after her husband's death. She is also a woman with significant legal and social connections. Her father was the famous Olafur the Peacock, and she is the sister of Kjartan Ólafsson, the tragic hero of Laxdæla saga. Thurid in Birka saga makes independent decisions about her household, her remarriage, and her response to the legal and practical difficulties that beset her. She is competent, unsentimental, and politically astute. What I find interesting about her is precisely that she is not extraordinary in the mythological sense. She is not a völva or a Shield-Maiden or a Valkyrie. She is a widow managing a farm in 10th century Iceland, dealing with the very ordinary complications of land, family, and the assembly. Her power is the power of the capable woman in her household, real, practical, and available, because the social structure allowed it. She's not a hero. She's just very, very competent. And in a world where competence was survival, that was enough. We've been circling around love for a while. Let's land on it. Did Viking Age women choose who they married? Formally, as we've established, the arrangement was made by families. But the question of consent, of whether the woman had any say, is more complicated in practice than the formal framework suggests. The sagas consistently present women who have opinions about their potential husbands. Opinions that matter to the narrative, even when they don't fully prevail. A woman who refused a match created a problem. A woman who accepted one enthusiastically created a slightly smoother situation. The preference was not nothing. There are also cases in the sagas where women explicitly choose. Thurid in Birka saga remarries of her own volition. The Deep-Minded gives her granddaughter in marriage with apparently careful attention to the girl's preferences, presenting the match formally and asking for consent. Gudrun Ósvífursdóttir, after her first divorce, has a period of independence in which she considers her options before her second marriage. Love in the sagas is presented as real and powerful. The love between Gudrun and Kjartan, between Brynhildr and Sigurður, between various heroes and the women they desired, is depicted as a force that shapes decisions and drives narrative. It is not subordinated to or replaced by the marriage contract. It exists alongside it, sometimes in harmony, often in conflict. The Mansanger, the love songs we mentioned earlier, are another indication that romantic feeling was taken seriously as a human experience. The fact that men composed love songs to specific named women, the fact that these songs were sometimes considered legally problematic. A man who composed love songs to a woman who didn't want them could face legal consequences. Unwanted romantic attention had legal dimensions, which is interesting, suggests that the emotional landscape of romantic desire was recognized and had social weight. Women were the objects of love songs, but the sagas also suggest they were the subjects of desire, capable of loving and choosing and pursuing. Gudrun chooses Kjartan in her heart. whatever the formal arrangements around her marriages might be. That choice and the consequences of it are the heart of the saga. Marriage for political alliance, the use of women as tools of diplomacy between families or kingdoms, was also thoroughly practiced. A king who gave his daughter to a neighboring king was creating a bond, making a peace, building an alliance. The woman was the instrument of that politics, whether she liked it or not. This is not unique to Scandinavia. It is universal in pre-modern elite society across the world. Women's bodies and their capacity for producing heirs were strategic resources. The Norse world was no exception. But the Norse legal framework, as we've discussed, did give women some recourse. The divorce provisions, the property rights, the ability, in principle, to speak at the assembly, these were not nothing. They did not make political marriages equal, but they gave women some minimal protections and some minimal agency within those structures. What about love? Marriages. Did they happen? Almost certainly. The sagas preserve cases where a couple clearly married for love and inclination against or alongside family arrangement. The elite sagas tend to emphasize the family dimension because that is where the legal and political drama lies. But ordinary people, ordinary farmers and their wives, probably had more latitude. A free farmer in rural Iceland with no great political alliances to manage had less family pressure about who his daughter married. The practical considerations, is he a good farmer? Is she a good manager? Are both families respectable? Probably dominated over dynastic calculation. Let's talk about the physical realities of women's lives, the biological ones. Childbirth in the Viking Age was dangerous, extremely dangerous. The maternal mortality rate, the rate at which women died in or shortly after childbirth, was high by modern standards, though it is difficult to quantify precisely from skeletal evidence. Skeletal analysis of women's remains from Viking Age sites shows significant numbers of women who died in their 20s and 30s, which is consistent with deaths related to childbirth and its complications. A woman who survived to give birth multiple times was in some sense lucky or robust, probably both. The saga women who appear as significant characters in middle and old age, Odd the Deep-Minded, Gudrun Osvifsdottir, Berg Thora in Jarl's saga, are the survivors, the ones who made it through. The management of childbirth's women's work. Midwifery was not a recognized medical profession in the same way it would be in later periods. There was no formal training, no guild, no official credential. But experienced women assisted at births, and the knowledge of how to manage labor and delivery was passed between women across generations. Herbal medicine was also a women's domain, at least in the household context. The treatment of minor illness, the management of injuries, the preparation of remedies. These were primarily female activities. Specific plants were associated with specific conditions. The knowledge was empirical, accumulated over generations, and belonged to the húsfreyja as part of her household competence. There is some overlap here with the magical tradition. The boundary between herbal remedy and magical working was not sharp in Viking Age thought. A woman who knew which plants to use for fever and which for pain was doing something practical and something knowledge-based. And the distinction between knowledge that works through natural means and knowledge that works through supernatural ones was not always clearly drawn. Death itself was treated with specific ritual attention, and women were central to the burial process. The preparation of a body for burial was typically done by women of the household. Washing, dressing, laying out. These were female activities. The Norner spun fate, but women in life managed the transition from it. Tending the body of the dead was a solemn responsibility. The keening of the dead, ritual's lamentation, formal mourning, is attested in Old Norse sources and is generally depicted as female practice. Women wailed for the dead. This was not uncontrolled grief. It was a social form. a ritual performance that had specific functions in the community's processing of loss. Widowhood was a specific social status. A widow in Viking Age society had more legal independence than a married woman. In some respects, she was not under her husband's guardianship any longer, and she could manage property and make decisions more independently. In practice, her situation depended enormously on her age, her children, her connections, and the resources she had. An older widow with adult sons was in a relatively strong position. Her sons were legally responsible for protecting her, and she had whatever property and status her husband's household had given her. A young widow with small children was more vulnerable. She needed her birth family's support or a new marriage to provide the household structure she needed. Widows remarrying was common and expected, particularly for younger women. The sagas don't treat it as remarkable. A woman with resources and connections could make a reasonably independent choice in her second marriage, having already satisfied the family's primary interest in her first. Let's drift northward and westward. Let's go to Greenland. The Norse colonization of Greenland began around 985 CE, led by Eric the Red, who had been banished from Iceland for manslaughter, and took the opportunity to explore and settle the large island to the west. He brought colonists back with him, and Norse settlements in Greenland persisted for around 5 centuries before dying out, for reasons that are still debated. Women came to Greenland with the first ships. They were part of the settler population. They ran households in an environment that was genuinely brutal. Colder, harsher, more isolated than Iceland. The growing season was shorter, the natural resources more limited, the connection to the rest of the Norse world more tenuous. The archaeological record from Greenland's Norse settlements is rich enough to tell us something about women's lives there. Textile production was essential, if anything, more essential than in Iceland, because trading for cloth was harder given the distances. Spinning and weaving were fundamental survival activities in Greenland Norse households. The farm at Gordon under Sandet, the farm under the sand, preserved by permafrost in the western settlement, has yielded extraordinary archaeological remains, including textiles, tools, and evidence of daily life in remarkable detail. The wool found there shows continuous textile production, the kind of work that occupied women's time constantly and produced the fabric that everyone wore, and that could be traded for the goods the settlement couldn't produce itself. Women in Greenland were also part of the contact and occasionally conflict with the indigenous populations. The Norse called them skralingar, a word that is somewhat derogatory in its implications. The first encounters between Norse settlers and what appear to have been Inuit or Dorset culture peoples were tense and sometimes violent. The sagas mention Norse women in the context of this contact, most notably Freydis Eiríksdóttir, one of the most dramatic and unsettling female characters in the entire Vinland tradition. Freydis, she appears in both Vinland sagas, in somewhat different versions that are hard to reconcile. In Eirik's saga Röða, she appears briefly but memorably. During an attack by Skralingar on the Norse camp at Vinland, the men retreat in panic. Freydis, heavily pregnant, cannot run fast. She grabs a sword from a dead man, faces the attackers, and slaps the sword against her bare breast, screaming. The attackers, apparently alarmed by this, retreat. Whether this is history or legend, it is a magnificent image. A pregnant woman with a sword, screaming at people who just killed her companions, protecting herself and her unborn child by the sheer force of her apparently terrifying presence. In Grenlandinga Saga, Freydis appears in a longer and far darker story. She organizes a trading expedition to Vinland, sharing the voyage with 2 Icelandic brothers. The expedition goes badly. Tensions rise. And Freydis, according to the saga, orchestrates the massacre of the brothers' entire company, men and women, and personally kills 5 women with an axe when the men of her company refuse to do it. Then she returns to Greenland and tries to cover it up. She is not presented sympathetically. The saga is very clear that this is a monstrous act, and yet she gets away with it, more or less. Eric the Red's prestige protects her family from consequences, though her reputation suffers. Freydis is a deeply uncomfortable figure in the Vinland tradition. She doesn't fit any of the more comfortable archetypes, not the capable húsfreyja, not the wise widow, not the faithful lover, not even the noble warrior. She is a woman who commits organized mass murder for commercial advantage and faces minimal consequences. Scholars debate whether the story is historical, exaggerated, or invented. The Greenlandinga saga version is generally considered less reliable than Eirik's saga Redda. But the image persists, this difficult, violent, apparently pragmatic woman on the edge of the known world, doing things that even by Viking Age standards required acknowledgement as terrible. She is part of the tradition too. Let's spend more time with Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir, because she deserves it. Gudrid's life as the saga's present, it begins in Iceland, where she was born to a farming family. She was noted for her beauty and intelligence. Her father, after various misfortunes, emigrated to Greenland, and Gudrid went with him. She arrived in Greenland during a period of hardship, a long cold winter, food shortages, anxiety, and it is in Greenland that she encounters Thorbjorg, the völva, the seeress whose ritual we described earlier in this script. Gudrid knows the spirit-calling songs that the ritual requires. She learned them from her Christian foster mother, who considered them pagan, but evidently taught them anyway. Gudrid performs the songs, and the working succeeds. There is something layered about this moment. A woman with Christian beliefs singing songs to call pagan spirits, assisting a völva in her practice. It is a collision of worlds, the old religion and the new, sitting together at a Greenlandic farm in the 10th century, doing what needs to be done. Gudrid's first husband dies during that difficult winter. She eventually marries Thorfinnur Karlsefni, Thorfinn Karlsefni, a wealthy Icelandic merchant. And together they lead the most sustained attempt at Norse settlement in Vinland, the territory on the coast of North America that the Norse explored around 1000 CE. In Vinland, Gudrid gives birth to a son. His name is Snorri. He is, if the saga tradition is accurate, the first European child born in the Americas. He precedes Columbus by nearly 5 centuries. Gudrid is present during the contacts with the Skrællingar, the complex, tense, eventually violent interactions between the Norse settlers and the indigenous peoples they encountered. She is depicted as competent and calm in dangerous circumstances. After the settlement fails, the Norse did not maintain their American presence, driven out by the hostility of the indigenous inhabitants, who vastly outnumbered them. Gudrid returns first to Greenland and then to Iceland with her son, Snorri. In Iceland, she does something remarkable. She makes a pilgrimage to Rome. She walks to Rome. In the early 11th century, from Iceland across the North Atlantic, through Britain, across the Channel, through France or Germany, over the Alps, to Rome. And then she comes back. She builds a church in Iceland, in the district where her son Snorri has settled. She becomes an anchoress, a solitary religious life, walled into a small cell attached to the church, in contemplative prayer. She outlives her time in a remarkable way. She spans pre-Christian and Christian worlds. She participates in völva ritual. She also becomes a nun. She raises a child in Vinland. She also walks to Rome. She is within the confines of what a woman of her period could do, someone who did nearly everything. Her descendants, the saga notes, included several bishops. As the Viking Age wore on toward its close in the late 11th century, the social framework for women was shifting. Christianization was the biggest driver of change. We've touched on this, but let's go into more detail. The Church's influence on marriage law was the most direct change. Canon law, gradually implemented across Scandinavia through the 11th and 12th centuries, imposed Christian marriage as the only valid form. This meant monogamy, a significant shift for elite men who had previously sometimes maintained concubines alongside their main wives, with the concubines' children having some recognized status. Under Christian law, legitimate marriage produced legitimate heirs, and everything else was illegitimate, full stop. For women, this change cut in complicated ways. On one hand, the end of the concubinage system meant the wife had a clearer, exclusive legal status. On the other hand, the dissolution of Norse divorce provisions left wives legally trapped in marriages they could not leave. The church also imposed increasingly strict rules on who could marry whom. Consanguinity rules, the prohibition on marrying close relatives, which extended several degrees out. In a society where kinship networks were dense and limited by geography, this had real practical effects and created genuine puzzles for families trying to arrange matches. The establishment of church courts, ecclesiastical jurisdiction over marriage disputes, moral offenses, and other previously secular matters, transferred power from the assembly and the kin group to the institution of the church. Women who had had legal standing in the assembly now had to navigate ecclesiastical structures that were largely closed to them as participants. Literacy, in the Latin and Christian sense, was also changing the information landscape. Manuscripts and written records were replacing or supplementing oral tradition, and the clerical infrastructure that produced and preserved manuscripts was exclusively male. The knowledge economy was shifting in ways that disadvantaged women's traditional roles as carriers of oral tradition. And yet, the Norwegian queen Margrethe, Margaret of Denmark, later, but in the Viking Age and early medieval period, Scandinavian queens held real political power. The Norwegian Queen Astrid, mother of Olaf Tryggvason, protected her son through his childhood in Russia with extraordinary courage and determination. She is a historical figure, not a saga one, and her actions in the sources are consistent with a woman of real political agency. The Danish Queen Thyra Danebod, sometimes called the Pride of Denmark, is credited with encouraging the building of the Ravning-Enge Bridge over the Vejle River, one of the great engineering works of Viking Age Denmark, and with defensive construction along the southern border. Her historical reality is debated, but her presence in the tradition is significant. Gunhildr Konungamóðir, Gunhild Mother of Kings, is one of the most contested and discussed figures in Norwegian royal history. She was the wife of Eiríkur Blóðax, Eric Bludax, King of Norway, and briefly of York. She appears in multiple sources as a powerful, scheming, magically capable woman who influenced her husband's court and later her son's courts, and was feared and respected and reviled in roughly equal measure. The sources are not friendly to her. She is presented as a villain in several saga contexts, as a practitioner of dangerous magic, as a manipulator of men, as ambitious for power beyond what was appropriate. The level of hostility in the sources is itself interesting. You don't need to that persistently disparage someone who had no power. Let's think about how Viking Age women were remembered. The runestones are part of it. The memorial stones raised by and for women, the permanent marks on the landscape, the names preserved in stone. Rak, Thora, Other, Helga. Names on stones, in places where the stones still stand. The sagas are the larger part. The women of the sagas, Gudrun, Odd, Bergthora, Freydis, Haldora, Thurid, the dozens of named women who populate these narratives, are the most detailed portraits we have of Viking Age women as social beings. They are filtered through centuries and male authors and Christian contexts. But they are there. Archaeology is the most honest part. The graves, the spindle whorls, the keys, the oval brooches, the weaving swords, the imported glass beads, objects that were real and were placed with specific people because those people had used them and been defined by them. Every spindle whorl in a grave is a whole woman's life. Every key is a whole household she managed. Every grave, however modest or grand, is someone who was there. The irony is that we remember Viking Age women less well than we remember Viking Age men. Mostly because the men are the ones in the written records of other societies, the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, the Frankish annals, the Byzantine histories. The Vikings who turn up in foreign records are almost always men doing violent things that foreigners felt compelled to document. Women didn't raid Paris. Women didn't sack Lindisfarne. But women managed the farms that made the raids possible. They produced the cloth that served as trade currency. They preserved the oral traditions that eventually became the sagas. They raised the children who became the next generation of traders and settlers, and occasionally raiders. They ran the households that were the basic unit of a society, that managed to create a distinctive and enduring civilization in some of the most challenging environments in the Northern Hemisphere. They were there for all of it. We keep coming back to textiles. Let's come back one more time and stay for a while. Textile production in the Viking Age was a sophisticated industry that modern observers consistently underestimate. The word spinning conjures something gentle and slow. What it actually was in the Viking Age was an activity that occupied a substantial portion of every woman's waking hours, from youth to old age, because the demand for spun yarn was enormous. Consider what was needed. Every person in the household required multiple garments: undergarments, outer garments, cloaks, footwear, headwear. Every animal required coverings in some cases. Sails, the great woolen sails of Viking longships, required vast quantities of specially woven fabric, so tightly woven as to catch wind without losing air. Ship sails were very high-value items, and they were made of wool that women had produced. One estimate, based on experimental archaeology, suggests that a single Viking Age ship's sail required the annual wool production of something like 100 sheep, and the equivalent of many hundreds of hours of spinning and weaving. The sail was made by women. The ship could not sail without them. The variety of textiles produced was also remarkable. Coarse wadmal for everyday wear, undyed or dyed with simple vegetable dyes, onion skin, weld, wode, finer fabrics for dress clothing. Tablet woven bands in complex patterns, sometimes using multiple colors of thread dyed with imported dyes. There is evidence of madder from the Middle East used in Viking Age Scandinavian textiles, which tells us about both the trade networks and the production aspiration. Embroidery, too. The Osberg tapestry fragments show complex pictorial weaving, narrative scenes, human figures, animals, processions. Whoever made them was an artist as well as a craftsperson. The technical skill and the aesthetic sensibility are both visible in the fragments. The textile tradition was also a form of cultural memory. The patterns, the techniques, the colors. These were not randomly generated. They were traditional, passed from mother to daughter, encoded with meaning. Specific patterns had specific associations. Specific colors had social significance. The woman who wore particular colors and particular designs was communicating, publicly, information about herself, her status, and her connections. She was also, sometimes, making political statements. The high-status woman dressed in specifically Norse style was asserting identity and belonging. This mattered in the diaspora contexts, in Ireland, in England, in Russia, where Norse settlers lived among different populations. The oval brooches, the characteristic Norse female dress, marked the wearer as Norse in an immediate and visible way. Speaking of diaspora, the Norse settlements in Britain, the Danelaw in England, the Norse kingdoms in Scotland and Ireland, were not all-male military occupations. They were, at least in part, genuine settlements, families. Women who crossed the sea and built households in foreign landscapes. The genetic evidence from northern Britain shows significant Norse female ancestry in some regions. This means women came. They weren't just represented by the Y chromosome of Norse warriors who had children with local women. There were also Norse women who brought their own mitochondrial DNA and had children who were fully Norse on both sides. These women navigated unfamiliar social environments. They may not have spoken the local language initially. They were building households in places with different plants, different animals, different resources than what they had known. The herbs for the medicine chest were not the same ones. The local crops were different. The social networks were new and needed to be built from scratch. And yet they did it. Because women in the Viking Age were, as we've established at considerable length, very good at building and managing households. It was what they were trained for. The core skills: spinning, weaving, managing food stores, organizing household labor, maintaining social relationships. These were portable. They worked in Yorkshire as well as in Vestfold. The Norse women who settled in England, Ireland, and Scotland left traces. Some of them, the wealthiest, left traces in graves. Norse-style burial in English or Irish soil. Oval brooches in the grave goods. Norse material culture in a British context. Some of them left traces in the language. Norse words for household and farming concepts filtered into English. And the fact that these words exist suggests Norse women talking about their work and their world in ways that affected the language around them. Some of them converted, adapted, assimilated. Their grandchildren were not particularly Norse anymore. They had become part of the local population, having brought their genes and their skills and some of their cultural practices and folded them into something new. The Viking Age Norse in Russia and the East are a different story. The Varangians, the Norse traders and warriors who penetrated the river systems of Eastern Europe and established trading settlements, and eventually the Principality of Kiev, were primarily male enterprises. The long-distance Eastern trade was harder to transport families on. The distances were greater, the winters more extreme, the violence more frequent. But here, too, there are traces of women. Some Norse women went east. Some settled in trading towns along the Volga and the Dnieper. Some married into local populations, creating the genetic and cultural blends that shaped the societies of what became Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. The archaeological record in Sweden, particularly in Birka, the great trading town that was a major node of the Eastern trade, shows the cosmopolitan reach of this world in the objects found in women's graves. Arabic silver coins used as jewelry, silk from Byzantium, bronze items from the steppe. High states women in Birka were connected to the world. And there is the Birka warrior grave again, always there, resisting easy interpretation. This woman, whoever she was surrounded by the gear of a fighter and was buried in the town that was the epicenter of the Eastern trade and the Varangian world. What was she? A warrior? A chieftain? Someone whose identity we can't reconstruct from the objects? We don't know. We may never know. That uncertainty is also history. It is a real limitation of the record. It does not excuse us from sitting with it. The Viking Age ends by conventional dating in 1066. The Battle of Hastings, the Norman conquest of England, the death of Harald Sigurdsson at Stamford Bridge a few weeks earlier. The Normans who took England were themselves the descendants of Norse settlers in northern France. Their name is literally from Northmen, the men of the north. But they had been French for generations, and their culture was French, not Norse. The Scandinavian world that had produced the Viking Age was still there. It didn't disappear. It converted, it urbanized, it integrated into the broader European Christian world, and it continued to produce interesting people and complicated history. But the particular cultural formation we call the Viking Age, the long ships, the extensive raiding and trading and settlement across half the world, the particular legal and social structures we've been discussing that was shifting and changing. For women, the trajectory over the following centuries was, broadly, toward greater restriction. The Church's consolidation of power over marriage, the growing emphasis on female virtue as synonymous with passivity and chastity, the reduction of women's legal standing in the emerging Scandinavian kingdoms. These changes accumulated over the 12th and 13th centuries. But the sagas were also being written down in those same centuries. The family sagas, the king's sagas, the mythological poems. This enormous literary outpouring in Iceland in the 12th and 13th centuries was preserving something. It was preserving a memory of a world where women had been something specific and particular, capable, legally present, given keys and authority and sometimes ships. The preservation was imperfect and filtered. But it happened. The women of the sagas, Gudrun, Odd, Freydis, Gudrid, Bergthora, all of them, were written down by men who were also in some sense memorializing a world that was passing. The old Iceland that the settlement generation had built, the old legal traditions, the old social forms. They were writing about their grandmothers and great-grandmothers, or their grandmother's world, and they wrote it with a particular quality of attention that suggests they found it worth preserving. Maybe they did that because they missed it, or recognized that something was lost, or simply because good stories are worth telling, and the women they were describing made for good stories. Either way, here we are. Let's return to the ground one last time. Let's go back to the graves. Somewhere in Norway, in the early 9th century, 2 women were prepared for burial in a great ship. The older one had lived with chronic pain. The analysis of her bones suggests she had arthritis or some equivalent condition. She had cared for herself and been cared for. She was old. She had survived everything up to the end. When she died, the people who loved her, or served her, or owed her, or feared her, built her a burial that took enormous resources to prepare. They sacrificed horses and dogs and oxen. They placed her in the ship with beds and wagons and tapestries and cooking equipment and personal belongings. They buried a younger woman with her, whose presence and purpose remain unclear. They raised a mound over the ship that was visible across the landscape. They did all of this for a woman. We still don't know her name. We still don't know with certainty what she was. Queens, seeress, chieftain's wife, religious figure. The ship and the mound and the objects say she was important. She was worth all of this. And then we found her 12 centuries later, and we are still talking about her, which is, in a way, exactly what the mound was intended to ensure. She is not the only one. She is just the most elaborate example. Every woman buried with keys was someone's húsfreyja, the manager of a real household, the person who knew where everything was. Every woman buried with spindle whorls and weaving swords was someone's textile producer, someone who made cloth that kept people warm and served as currency and was traded across the world. Every woman named on a runestone was someone's mother, wife, sister, daughter, someone whose loss was worth permanent inscription in stone. Every woman in the sagas, even the difficult ones, even Freydis with her axe, even Gunhildr with her ambitions, was someone whose life was complex enough to generate a story, which is all any of us can really ask. The Viking Age produced a world of salt water and cold wind and hard work and extraordinary creative and practical achievement. Women were part of that world at every level, not equally, not without constraint, not without suffering, but present, legally recognized, economically necessary, sometimes powerful, always there. They managed the farms, they made the cloth, they raised the children, they sang the spirit-calling songs, they held the keys, they buried the dead, they spoke at the assembly, they crossed the North Atlantic, they gave birth in Vinland, they walked to Rome, they were there. We've been at this for a while now. 2 hours or thereabouts, give or take your particular narrator's pace. We've come a long way from a farm in 9th century Norway to a grave under a mound, to Greenland, to Vinland, to a pilgrimage road, to Rome and back again. We've talked about spindle whorls and runestones, and saga women, and Valkyries, and velour, and divorce proceedings, and textile currency, and ship burials, and women who walked to Rome, and women who killed people with axes in Vinland, and women who ran enormous farming households with quiet, daily competence for decades. We've talked about what Viking women could do, and what they couldn't, about the legal framework that gave them specific and, in some cases, unusual protections for the period, and about the changes that eroded those protections as Christianity consolidated its hold, about the gap between the ideal and the reality, and about the women who somehow managed to be both extraordinary and ordinary at the same time. The keys are the image I keep coming back into. The keys that archaeologists find in women's graves, the keys that hung from belt fittings in public view, the keys that said, "I am in charge of something here. I am the one who knows where things are. I am the one who opens and closes and manages and maintains." It's a quiet kind of power. It doesn't make the sagas the way raiding does. It doesn't get recorded in Anglo-Saxon chronicles. But it kept the world running, generation after generation, in a landscape that did not make surviving easy. The women who held those keys were doing something real, something that mattered, something worth spending 2 hours talking about, very slowly on a quiet night. So, thank you for spending this time here. If you've fallen asleep somewhere around Gudrun Osvifstotir, that's fine. That's appropriate. She would probably find it a fitting tribute. If you're still awake, go to sleep. The farm will be there in the morning. The keys are on the table. Everything is where it's supposed to be. Good night.